is a small creek in northern Georgia where the water still runs cold over a bed of pale stone. And if you crouch down on the right kind of afternoon, you can see flecks of something yellow winking up at you from the sand. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. That creek has a name now, but it had an older name once, spoken in a language the hills knew long before any wagon road cut through them. The story most folks learn in school goes something like this. A long time ago, the United States government decided the Cherokee people needed to move west. It was sad, the books say. It was unfortunate. Many died on a cold walk to a far country, and we call that walk the Trail of Tears. The story is told gently, the way you might cover a chipped plate with a clean cloth so the crack does not show. But there is another part of the story, a quieter part, a part that smells like wet river stone and old iron, a part that glints just barely under the surface of everything you were told. The land the Cherokee lived on was not just hills and rivers and good corn ground. The land was full of gold, not a little gold, not a story gold, real gold, soft and heavy and yellow as butter, lying in the creek beds and tucked into the seams of the white quartz that ran through those mountains like fat in good meat. The Cherokee knew it was there. They had known for a long time. They wore small pieces of it sometimes, beaten thin, and they pointed travelers toward it without much fuss, because to them it was just another thing the mountain gave, the way the mountain gave chestnuts and clear water and shade. Then, in the late 1820s, a white boy in Georgia bent down by a creek and picked up something shining, and the whole world tilted on its axis. What followed was the first true gold rush in American history. Years before California, years before the Klondike, men came pouring into the Cherokee Nation from every farm and port and crossroads in the southern states. They came with picks and pans and mules and whiskey. They came with no permission and no patience. And the government, watching from far away, did a strange thing. It did not send them home. Instead, it began to write laws. Quiet, careful laws. Laws that said the Cherokee could not testify in court, laws that said Cherokee gold was no longer Cherokee gold. Laws that turned the Cherokee Nation on paper into something thinner than smoke. And while these laws were being written, the army was being readied, and stockades were being built in the pines. And a man named Andrew Jackson was sharpening a pen at a desk in Washington. This is the story they polished until it shined. The official story says the removal was about land, about cotton, about the hunger of a young country for room to grow. All of those things are true, but underneath the polish, down where the polish never quite reaches, there is another truth, a truth the size and weight and color of a gold coin. The Trail of Tears was not only about land, it was about what was under the land. It was about a metal that nobody in the official record wants to name as the reason. Because to name, it would be to admit something the country has never quite admitted out loud. That an entire people were marched 1,000 miles through winter snow, not because the soil was wanted for corn, but because the rock beneath their feet was wanted for money, the mint that the United States built to coin that gold sits there still. The town that grew up around it has a name in the old Cherokee tongue, and that name means yellow money. The creeks still carry the dust. The mountains still hold the seams. And somewhere in the archives, in letters and ledgers and quiet folded maps, the story sits, waiting for someone to lift the cloth off the chipped plate and look at the crack underneath. That is what we are going to do, slow and careful, over these next few hours. We are going to walk back to a small creek in Georgia on a soft autumn afternoon, when a boy first bent down and saw something shining. And we are going to follow the gleam wherever it leads us, even into the places the school books would rather we did not look. The year is 1828. The place is the southern end of the Appalachian Mountains, where Georgia rises up out of its red clay flats and starts climbing toward the sky. The hills here are soft and old. They have rounded shoulders, the way old grandfathers do, and they wear long coats of oak and hickory and pine. In the fall, those coats turn gold and copper and deep wine red. In the summer, they stay so green it almost hurts your eyes to look at them too long. The creeks run cold and clear down these slopes, tumble over stones the color of river otters. They pool in still places under leaning sycamores, where minnows hang in the current like little silver coins. The water tastes sweet. The water tastes like rain that has been filtered through 1,000 feet of mountain stone. This is Cherokee country, has been for as long as anyone can remember, and longer still. The Cherokee call themselves the Aniivwia, which means the principal people. Their towns sit tucked in the valleys, near the good water, near the good bottomland where corn grows tall. Smoke rises from log council houses. Children play in the shallows of the creeks, while their grandmothers grind acorns into meal on flat stones worn smooth by 100 years of patient hands. Picture a morning in late summer. The air is still cool. Mist hangs low along the creek bottoms like the breath of some sleeping animal. The sun has not yet climbed over the ridge, and the world is painted in soft blue and pearl gray. A boy walks down to the water. He might be white, or he might be Cherokee, or he might be the mixed blood son of a trader who married into the tribe. The old stories cannot quite agree. What the stories do agree on is this: he was young, and he was alone, and he stopped to drink. He kneels on the bank. The moss is wet under his knees. He cups his hands and dips them into the creek, and the cold of it shocks him a little, the way mountain water always does. And then he sees it. Down at the bottom of the pool, half buried in pale sand, something is shining. It is not the shine of mica, which everybody knows. Mica flakes off and floats. Mica is silver and brittle. This thing is heavier. This thing is the color of butter, of the inside of a sunflower, of the late afternoon light on a wheat field. He reaches in. His fingers close around it. When he lifts it out, water runs down his wrist in cold ribbons, and the lump in his palm catches the first light coming over the ridge. He has held coins before, maybe a Spanish silver dollar, maybe a copper penny worn smooth with handling. This is heavier than any coin its size. This is so heavy it feels wrong, like the world has forgotten its own rules. He bites it the way he has seen men bite metal. His teeth leave a mark. The mark is small and bright, and it does not go away when he rubs it. A grown man will name what the boy is holding. The The man will use a word the boy may not yet know. Gold. The town nearest to that creek is small. A handful of cabins, a trading post, a blacksmith with a forge that glows orange before dawn. The houses are built of hewn logs chinked with red clay. Smoke curls from stone chimneys. Roosters call from the dooryards. Men wear linsey-woolsey shirts and homespun trousers, and broad felt hats gone soft with sweat. Women wear long dresses of dyed cotton and aprons stained from wood ash and berry juice. Light comes from tallow candles and pine knots. The night is darker here than you can easily imagine. Dark enough to see every star the sky has to offer. This is the world the boy walks back into, with that lump of yellow weight in his pocket. He does not know yet that he is carrying the seed of a storm. He does not know that the thing in his hand will draw thousands of strangers into these hills with picks and pans and powder. He does not know it will write laws. He does not know it will move armies. He does not know it will empty the valleys he has grown up in and scatter the principal people across a frozen 1,000 miles. He only knows the creek is cold and his hands are wet, and something in his pocket feels heavier than it has any right to be. Long before the boy bent over that creek with a yellow stone in his palm, the Cherokee already knew the mountains were full of gold. They had walked these hills for more years than anyone could count. Their grandfathers had walked them, and their grandfathers' grandfathers. The ridges and hollows of North Georgia were not wild country to them. They were home. The Cherokee called themselves the Aniunwia, which means the principal people. They lived in towns of log cabins and council houses, with smoke rising soft from stone chimneys in the cool blue mornings. The houses stood in clearings near the rivers, with corn fields stretching out behind them, and apple trees growing in tidy rows. By the early 1800s, many Cherokee homes looked much like the homes of their white neighbors. There were beds with quilts, iron kettles on the hearth, and chickens scratching in the yard. A man named Major Ridge lived in one of these homes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face cut sharp as a hatchet. He owned a farm near the Oostenaula River, with peach orchards and a ferry he ran across the water. He wore a white shirt and a dark coat, and he spoke in a slow, measured voice. He had fought beside Andrew Jackson in old wars. He believed for a long time that the two peoples could live as friends. His son was John Ridge. The boy had been sent to school in Connecticut, far from the southern pines, and he came back speaking English as smooth as river stones. John was thin and bookish, with dark eyes and quick hands. He read law books by candlelight. He wrote letters in careful, looping script. He had married a white woman from the north, and the two of them lived in a fine house with glass windows that caught the morning light. Then there was John Ross. He was small and quiet, only an 8th Cherokee by blood, with sandy hair and pale skin. But his heart was Cherokee through and through. He had grown up speaking the language and learning the old stories at his mother's knee. He wore a wool suit and round spectacles, and he carried papers under his arm wherever he went. The people had chosen him as their principal chief. He spent his days writing letters to Washington, asking the white men to keep their promises. These were not wandering hunters. These were farmers and traders and politicians. They ran stores and grist mills. They published a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in both English and the syllabary, that a silversmith named Sequoia had invented all by himself. Sequoia was a quiet, lame man who limped through the towns with a long pipe and a soft smile. He had given his people a written language out of thin air. Children learned to read in months. Old men wrote letters to their cousins in distant valleys, and all of them knew about the gold. The grandmothers told the children about it. They pointed to the streams where the yellow flecks shone in the gravel. They told them about the soft metal that could be hammered flat. The way the old people had made ornaments and beads from it before the white traders ever came. There was a word for it in the Cherokee tongue. There was a place in the mountains the people had named for it, a place where the earth gave up the yellow stuff like rain gives up rivers. But gold was not what the Cherokee wanted from these hills. They wanted the hills themselves. They wanted the cold springs and the laurel slicks. They wanted the sound of the wind moving through the long-needled pines. They wanted the graves of their grandparents under the leaves. Gold, to them, was just one more thing the land offered. Pretty, yes. Useful for trading sometimes, but not worth more than the soil it sat in. The white men did not understand this. The white men only understood the yellow. So picture them now, these people, in the years just before the storm. Major Ridge on his porch at sunset, watching the river curl past his ferry landing. John Ridge bent over his writing desk, the quill scratching softly. John Ross walking the muddy streets of the Cherokee capital at New Echota, his coat flapping in the wind. Sequoia teaching another farmer to read by the light of a pine knot fire. Women grinding corn in wooden mortars. Children running barefoot through the dewy grass. They had built something here, something that took 100 lifetimes to grow. And under all of it, sleeping in the bones of the mountain, the yellow money waited for the wrong men to find it. The word the Cherokee used for it was Dahlonega. It meant yellow money, or the color of gold, depending on who you asked and which elder did the telling. The sound of it rolled off the tongue like water over smooth stones. Dahlonega. 3 soft syllables that held a whole world inside them. Before the wagons came, before the strangers, before the maps changed hands in lamplit rooms, the place was just a place. A bend of land in the North Georgia hills, where the streams ran cold and the laurel grew thick along the banks. The Cherokee had lived there for so long that nobody remembered when they had arrived. Their stories said they had always been there. Their bones in the ground said the same. Morning came slow to those hills. The mist would settle in the hollows overnight and rise off the creeks like breath off a sleeping animal. The first light would touch the tops of the pines and turn them gold for a few minutes, then silver, then the steady green of full day. Smoke would lift from the chimneys of the log homes scattered through the valleys. Women would step outside to feed the chickens. Dogs would stretch in the doorways. The Cherokee homes by that time looked much like any other home in the southern hills. Square cabins built of hewn timber with stone chimneys and shake roofs. Some had glass windows. Some had porches with rocking chairs worn smooth by years of use. Inside, you would find iron pots hanging over the hearth, woven baskets along the walls, beds made up neat with quilts pieced from scrap cloth. spinning wheel in the corner, a Bible on the table next to a hymn book printed in Cherokee letters. That was the strange and beautiful thing about Cherokee country in those years. It was not the wild frontier the newspapers up north liked to imagine. It was farmland. It was orchards heavy with apples in the fall. It was fields of corn stretching down to the river. It was schools where children learned to read and write in 2 languages. It was a printing press in New Echota that turned out a newspaper every week. It was a written constitution. It was a council house where elected men gathered to make laws. The men worked their fields the way farmers had always worked their fields. They walked behind plows pulled by mules. They mended fences in the cool of the morning. They sat on porches in the heat of the afternoon and traded news with neighbors who rode by on horseback. Some kept cattle. Some kept hogs that ran half wild in the woods and were rounded up in the fall. Some panned a little gold from the creeks when the corn was in and the work was light, the same way a man might fish or hunt for the pleasure of it. The women kept the gardens, and the children and the small economies of the household. They dried apples on long boards in the sun. They put up beans and squash for winter. They wove cloth on looms set up in the front rooms of their cabins. They visited each other in the long blue evenings, carrying babies on their hips and bringing pies wrapped in clean cloth. The children ran barefoot through the summer grass. They learned to swim in the same creeks where their grandmothers had bathed as girls. They learned the old names for the plants and the new names too. They learned the names of the mountains, which the Cherokee had given long before any white man wrote them down. Yana, Trey, Cohutta, words that sounded like the land itself. On Sunday mornings, bells rang in small white churches built among the trees. The singing came drifting out the open windows, slow and sweet, and harmonized in the close country style. Cherokee voices and white voices sometimes mixed in the same pews, because by then the lines between the two had blurred in many families. Cousins on both sides, marriages going back 2 and 3 generations. The creeks kept running. The pines kept growing. The deer came down to drink at dusk. The owls called to each other across the dark hollows at night. The seasons turned in their slow, patient circle. Spring to summer to fall to winter, and back again. The way they had turned for 1,000 years. And in the gravel of the stream beds, glinting up through the clear water when the sun struck right, the soft yellow metal lay waiting. The Cherokee knew it was there. They had always known. They called the place by its name. Dahlonega, yellow money. And for a long time, that name was just a name, and the gold was just gold, and the world was still quiet. The first thing that changed was the paper. Not the big newspapers in Atlanta or Washington. Not the official documents filed in courthouses with red seals and looping signatures. Something smaller, something quieter. Pieces of paper folded twice and slipped into coat pockets. Maps drawn by hand, in ink that bled a little where the rain touched it. Maps that showed the bend of a creek, the shoulder of a hill, the place where a certain oak tree leaned over a certain stream. These maps started moving through the southern mountains in the late summer of 1828. Nobody could tell you exactly who drew the first one. They passed from saddlebag to saddlebag, from tavern table to barn loft, from one rough hand to another. Men paid good silver for them. Some men paid in whiskey. Some paid in promises they never kept. Picture a small tavern on a dirt road in upcountry Georgia. The walls are rough pine boards, dark with smoke. A fire burns low in a stone hearth, throwing orange light across the floor. The air smells of cornbread and pipe tobacco and wet wool drying near the flames. Outside, a thin rain falls on the red clay road, and the horses tied to the post stand with their heads low. Inside, two men sit at a corner table. One wears a long brown coat speckled with mud at the hem. The other wears boots so new they still creak when he moves his feet. Between them, on the worn wood of the table, a folded paper opens like a leaf. The man in the brown coat keeps one finger on the paper. His other hand rests near his cup. He does not look at the door, but he is listening to it. This is what was happening all over the foothills that fall. Strangers showed up in towns where strangers had never come before. They asked careful questions. They asked about the creeks. They asked which streams ran clear and which ran muddy. They asked who owned what, and then they asked who really owned what, which was a different question entirely. The Cherokee farmers noticed them first. A man would be plowing a field, and he'd look up to see a rider stopped on the road, just watching, not waving, not calling out, just watching the way the land lay, watching how the water moved. Then the rider would tip his hat, almost polite, and ride on. Word traveled the old way, by mouth and by foot, from cabin to cabin along the ridges, from smokehouse to council fire. Something is happening, the old people said. Something is moving under the surface, like a fish under still water. You cannot see it, but you can see the ripple. In the town of Dahlonega, which was not yet called Dahlonega, a man named Benjamin Parks would later tell the story of finding a stone in a creek that shone yellow when he rubbed the mud off. He told it many ways over the years. The details changed. The year changed. But the heart of the story stayed the same. He bent down. He picked up a stone. The stone was heavy in a way stones should not be. And while Benjamin Parks was telling that story to a few neighbors in low voices, the maps kept moving. A surveyor named John passed through a small settlement and left with a roll of papers under his arm. A lawyer from Milledgeville wrote a letter to a cousin in Savannah and sealed it with green wax. A blacksmith in a hollow on the Etowah River started taking on new work, branding tools, picks, pans hammered out of sheet iron. He did not ask who the tools were for. He was paid in coin, and the coin was good. The mountains themselves looked no different. The same blue ridges rolled away in every direction, soft as smoke at the horizon. The same morning mist sat in the valleys until the sun lifted it. The same hawks turned slow circles above the pines. But the air had a new feeling in it, a kind of tightness, like a held breath. A Cherokee elder, walking a familiar path one cold morning, stopped at a place where a deer trail crossed the road. He stood very still. The wind moved through the laurel. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and stopped. He looked down at the road and saw the print of a boot he did not know. A heavy boot, a new boot, pointed toward the creek. He stood there a long time. Then he turned and he walked home, and he did not say what he had seen. Not yet. news moved through the hills the way smoke moves through pine. Slow at first, then everywhere at once. By the spring of 1829, the little settlement at the foot of the Blue Ridge was no longer sleepy. It was wide awake, and it could not seem to close its eyes. Auraria, Dahlonega, two names for the same fever. The town sat in a fold of green mountains, the kind of place where you could hear a hawk cry from a mile off. Wooden cabins with shake roofs leaned against the slopes. Smoke curled from clay chimneys. A creek ran through the middle of it, all clear and cold, and now full of strangers crouched along its banks with pans in their hands. Old Mr. Tate, who ran the general store, kept a slate by the door. He used to mark down sales of flour and salt and lamp oil. Now he wrote down picks, shovels, tin pans. He could barely keep them in stock. A wagon from Augusta would roll in on Tuesday, and by Thursday the shelves stood bare again. Tate told anyone who would listen that he had never seen the like, not even when the cotton boom came through the lowlands when he was a boy. On the church steps Sunday mornings, the women traded news the way men traded mules. Sarah Coker said her brother-in-law had walked into the hills with a borrowed mule and walked out 3 days later with enough yellow dust to buy a wagon. Mary Bate Holcomb said her cousin had found a nugget the size of a hen's egg lying right on top of the ground, just sitting there in the leaves like it had been waiting. Nobody could say if these stories were true, but nobody could say they were false either. At the tavern, the talk went deeper. The old men sat by the fire and remembered. There had been rumors before, they said, back in their grandfather's day. Spaniards had come through these mountains looking for the same yellow shine. Hernando de Soto, 300 years gone, dragging his armored men through the laurel thickets. The old men said the Spanish had found something. They said the Spanish had also found that the Cherokee did not want them digging, and so the Spanish had moved on, and the gold had stayed where it was, sleeping under the moss. One old trapper named Jeb Whitfield claimed he had known about the gold since he was a young man. He said a Cherokee friend had shown him a stream once, back in the 20s, and told him the water there carried color if you knew how to look. Jeb said he had never told a soul because his friend had asked him not to. he said, it didn't matter anymore. Everybody knew. The secret had broken open like a dropped jar. The town itself was changing by the week. Tents bloomed along the creek banks like white mushrooms after a rain. Men slept in wagons. Men slept under trees. A boarding house went up in 11 days, raw pine boards still bleeding sap. The blacksmith worked from dark to dark, his fire never going cold, the ring of his hammer carrying up the hollers like a church bell that had forgotten how to stop. A new tavern opened, then another, then a third. Whiskey flowed in like the creek itself, and fights broke out over claims that nobody had a real right to make. The Cherokee families who lived nearby watched all this with quiet faces. Their cabins sat in clearings up the ridge, their cornfields green and tidy, their split-rail fences holding back nothing now. Children would come down to the trading post with their mothers and see the strangers crouched in the water, and the children would ask questions, and the mothers would answer softly and lead them home. The old folks among the Cherokee shook their heads. They had stories too, stories about what happens when men chase the yellow metal. None of those stories ended well. At the general store, a preacher named Eldridge stood one afternoon and told anyone who would listen that the gold was a test from God. He said the mountain was being weighed, and the men in it were being weighed, and the soul of the country was being weighed all at once. Most folks laughed at him. A few nodded slow. Mr. Tate kept marking down picks on his slate. Outside, the creek ran on, silver in the morning, brown in the afternoon, where 10,000 boots had stirred its bed, and nobody yet knew what all this stirring would finally bring up to the light. The man who sat behind the governor's desk in Milledgeville that year was named George Gilmer. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and a careful way of writing. He kept his letters short. He kept his decisions sharper. And in the autumn of 1830, a letter crossed his desk that he would read more than once before answering. The letter came from a federal agent stationed near the Cherokee line. It spoke of gold, not rumors of gold, not whispers of gold. Real gold pulled from real creeks by men who had no right to be standing where they stood. The agent wanted to know what the governor planned to do. Trespassers were crossing into Cherokee land by the hundreds, some by the thousands. They were panning the streams. They were digging the banks. They were sleeping under pine trees that did not belong to them on soil that belonged to another nation entirely. Gilmer read the letter. Then he set it down, and the answer he gave was not the answer the agent expected. To understand why, you have to walk backward a little. You have to go back before Gilmer, back before the boy at the creek, back before the maps started changing hands in quiet rooms. The mountains of North Georgia had been Cherokee land for longer than any written record could measure. The old stories said the people came from the smoke of the first fire. The old stories said the mountains were the bones of something sleeping, and inside those bones, the yellow metal had always been there, glinting in the seams of quartz, drifting down the creeks every spring when the snowmelt loosened the gravel. The Cherokee had not built their world around the gold. They had built it around the corn and the rivers and the council houses. Gold was pretty. Gold was useful for ornament, but it was not the center of anything. That was the part the newcomers could never quite understand. The newcomers saw the yellow metal and saw a future. The Cherokee saw the yellow metal and saw the same earth they had always known. Spanish men in iron helmets had come through these hills 300 years before. Hernando de Soto and his soldiers had marched up from Florida looking for cities of gold. They had found villages instead. They had found cornfields and ball games and people who fed them and then asked them to leave. The Spanish wrote down what they saw. They wrote down rumors of metal in the high country. They wrote down the names of rivers they could not pronounce. Then they marched on, and most of them died, and the maps they left behind got folded into drawers in Madrid and forgotten. But the rumors did not die. Rumors never die. They sleep in libraries. They sleep in the back rooms of trading posts. They sleep in the heads of old men who tell their grandsons' stories by the fire. And by the time George Gilmer sat at his desk in 1830, the rumors had been sleeping for almost 3 centuries. They were ready to wake up. The Cherokee Nation by then was not the Cherokee Nation of De Soto's time. It had changed. It had its own written language, invented by a silversmith named Sequoia. It had a newspaper printed in 2 tongues. It had a constitution. It had a capital at New Echota with neat streets, and a courthouse, and a council chamber where men in suits debated laws. The Cherokee had done everything the newcomers said they should do. They had farmed, they had built, they had written, they had organized, and still the gold was there. Still, the creeks ran heavy with it. Still, the white men came over the line at night with pans and picks and dreams. Gilmer wrote his answer. He did not order the trespassers removed. He did not protect the Cherokee boundary. Instead, he wrote to Washington. He wrote that the gold was a Georgia matter. He wrote that the Cherokee Nation was a Georgia problem. He wrote that the federal government had promised long ago to clear the Indians from the state, and the time had come to make good on that promise. The letter was polite. The letter was careful. The letter was, in its quiet way, a door swinging open. What had been a small story about a boy and a creek was now a story about a state and a nation, and a metal older than any of them. The mountains had been waiting a long time to be noticed. Now they had been noticed by exactly the wrong people. And the governor of Georgia had put his name on a piece of paper that would echo for the next 10 years. The man in the White House had a long face and gray eyes the color of river stones. Andrew Jackson sat at his desk in Washington, and the letters came to him in stacks. Some came from Georgia. Some came from Tennessee. Some came from men he had known since the war, men he had fought beside in the swamps and the cane fields, men whose voices he trusted more than any other voices in the world. These were the wrong men. They told him what he already wanted to hear. They told him the Cherokee were standing on land that white settlers needed. They told him the gold in the North Georgia hills was being wasted, sitting there under the feet of people who would not dig it out the way it ought to be dug. They told him the country was growing, and the country needed room, and the country needed money, and there was money in those hills, more money than anyone could count. Jackson read these letters by candlelight. The wax dripped onto the desk in slow yellow tears. Outside his window, the magnolias bloomed white as bone. spring air carried the smell of tobacco from the warehouses down by the river. He had decisions to make. He had always been a man who made his decisions quickly, the way a soldier decides which way to charge. He listened to Wilson Lumpkin, the new governor of Georgia, a stern man with deep lines carved around his mouth. Lumpkin wrote like a man who already owned what he was asking for. He listened to John Eaton, his Secretary of War, a friend so close he was almost a brother. He listened to Lewis Cass, a heavy man with cold eyes who would take Eaton's place later. These men spoke the same language. They used soft words for hard things. They called removal a kindness. They called the taking of land an exchange. They called the breaking of treaties a necessity. Somewhere in the Carolinas, a young Cherokee boy was learning to read English in a missionary school built of rough-cut pine. He did not know that his future was being decided in a room he would never see, by men who would never know his name. The wind moved through the schoolhouse window, and the pages of his book turned by themselves, and his teacher smiled and said the wind had finished the lesson for him. Back in Washington, the lamps burned late. Jackson signed a piece of paper in May of 1830. The Indian Removal Act, they called it. It was written in careful handwriting on thick paper that smelled faintly of vellum and ink. The words were polite. The words were measured. The words said nothing about gold, but the gold was there in the room with them. The gold was the reason. Anyone who looked at a map could see it. The Cherokee Nation sat right on top of the richest strike east of the Mississippi. Dahlonega was already pulling yellow rocks from the dirt by the bucketful, and every bucket made the question louder. A few honest men tried to look into the matter. There were missionaries living among the Cherokee, men like Samuel Worcester, who wrote letters back to the newspapers in Boston and New York. He described what he saw with his own eyes. He saw families farming neat fields. He saw schoolhouses and printing presses. He saw a written language invented by a silversmith named Sequoia, who had carved each letter himself out of nothing. Worcester told the world that this was a nation, a real one, with laws and books and gardens and churches. The world did not listen. travelers came down from the north to see for themselves. Some of them wrote in their journals about what they found. They described log homes with glass windows. They described Cherokee women weaving cloth on wooden looms by firelight. They described a town called New Echota with a council house and a newspaper office where ink stained the floorboards black as midnight. These journals exist still. You can read them in old libraries, in the yellow pages of books nobody has opened in 100 years. The journalists who came south wrote what they saw, and then they went home, and their stories were folded into back pages or lost altogether. The men around Jackson kept whispering. The gold kept glittering. The letters kept arriving on the president's desk, neat stacks of paper that smelled of pine smoke and ambition. And Jackson, who had once been a boy with nothing, who had built himself out of war and willpower, signed his name to the thing the wrong men had been asking for all along. The laws came down from the State House in Milledgeville like cold rain. They were written on heavy paper, sealed with wax, and signed by men who had never walked a Cherokee field. But the people who lived under those laws remembered them, and some of their words have survived, passed down through families, copied into old letters, whispered around hearths long after the fires of the old country had gone cold. There was a man named John Martin. He served as treasurer of the Cherokee Nation, and he lived in a fine white house with glass windows and a wide front porch. He wrote about the morning the Georgia Guard came riding up his lane. The horses kicked dust into the air like a slow yellow cloud. The men wore blue coats and carried long muskets, and their faces were sunburned under their black hats. John Martin said the captain rode right up to his steps without dismounting. The captain told him the house no longer belonged to him. A white man had won it in the lottery. John Martin had 30 days to leave. He wrote later that he stood there in his own doorway, feeling like a guest in a stranger's home. A Cherokee woman named Nancy remembered something different. She lived near the Etowah River in a small cabin with a stone chimney and a roof of split shingles. She told her grandchildren about the day a surveyor came walking through her cornfield. He carried a brass instrument on 3 wooden legs, and a chain of iron links that clinked as he dragged it. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He walked across her beans and her squash as if she were not there at all. Nancy said that was the moment she understood. The laws had made her invisible. The land could see her, the river could see her, but the men with the chains and the papers could not. A missionary named Samuel Worcester wrote letters from a jail cell in Milledgeville. The state of Georgia had passed a law saying no white man could live among the Cherokee without taking an oath to the state. Worcester refused. He said the Cherokee nation was sovereign, and no oath to Georgia could change that. They came for him in the spring. They put him in chains and walked him miles down a red clay road. He wrote that the iron rubbed his wrists raw, and the dust settled in the cracks of his skin until he looked like he was made of the earth itself. He wrote that the worst part was not the chains. The worst part was knowing that the laws had been built like a fence around his friends, and the gate had only one direction. A young Cherokee man named Elias Boudinot ran a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix. He printed it on a heavy iron press in the town of New Echota. The press had been shipped down from Boston in wooden crates, and the type was cast in 2 alphabets, English on one side and the Cherokee syllabary on the other. Elias wrote about the laws as they came, one after another, like stones dropped into still water. The law that said Cherokee could not testify against a white man in court. The law that said Cherokee could not meet in council. The law that said Cherokee could not dig for gold on their own land. He wrote that each law felt like a window being shuttered. By the end, he said, the house was dark in the middle of the day. There was an old woman whose name has been lost, but whose words were written down by a traveler passing through the mountains. She sat outside her cabin in the cool of the evening, weaving river cane into a basket. The traveler asked her what she thought of the new laws. She kept weaving. She did not look up. She said the white men had made a paper that said the land was no longer hers, but the land had never been hers to begin with. The land belonged to itself. The laws were like a child shouting at a mountain. The mountain heard nothing. The mountain went on being a mountain. She said the only thing the laws could take was the part of the land where her feet stood. And her feet, she said, were old and tired anyway. These were the witnesses. They saw the laws arrive like weather. They watched the doors of their own houses become someone else's doors. And underneath every law, like a vein of yellow metal running through gray stone, was the same quiet reason nobody wrote down. Now here is where the pieces start to fit together. Step back from the story for a moment and look at it from above, the way a hawk might look down on the southern mountains. From up there, you can see the shape of things. You can see the timing. You can see how every road, every law, every quiet decision in a marble office seems to bend toward the same patch of ground. The patch of ground is Cherokee country. The shape is a circle drawn around the gold. In 1835, while Cherokee families were still living in their cabins, still tending their corn, still teaching their children the old songs, the United States government did something strange. It built a mint, not a small assay office, not a temporary outpost, a real federal mint made of brick and stone, with iron presses and locked vaults and clerks in starched collars. They built it in a town called Dahlonega, the same Dahlonega whose name means yellow money in the old tongue, the same Dahlonega that sat right on the edge of land the Cherokee still legally owned. Think about what that means. A mint is not a thing you put up overnight. A mint takes years to plan. It takes acts of Congress. It takes architects and surveyors and shipments of heavy machinery hauled by oxen up muddy mountain roads. You do not build a federal mint in a place unless you are certain, deeply certain, that gold will keep flowing out of that ground for a very long time. And the men who ordered it built were the same men who, at that very moment, were telling the public a different story. They were saying the Cherokee land was poor. They were saying the removal was for the good of the tribes themselves. They were saying there was nothing in those hills worth fighting over. Yet the mortar was still wet on the mint walls when the lottery wheels began to turn. Look at the dates and watch them rhyme. Gold confirmed in 1828. Georgia passes laws stripping Cherokee rights in 1830. Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act that same year. The land lottery begins in 1832. Construction on the Dahlonega Mint starts in 1835. The mint opens its doors in 1838, and 1838 is the spring the soldiers came with bayonets to empty the cabins. Lay those years out like stones along a creek bed. They form a path. They lead in one direction only. The building itself was handsome. White columns, a wide front porch, tall windows that caught the morning light coming over the ridges. Inside, the floors were heart pine, polished smooth. The vault sat in the back, thick-walled and cold even in summer. Coining presses stood in a row, each one heavy as a wagon, their iron flywheels gleaming under oil lamps. The air smelled of hot metal and machine grease, and the faint sulfur of melted ore. Outside, the mountains rolled away in every direction, soft and blue, and folded like a quilt thrown across a bed. Dogwoods bloomed white in the spring. The creeks ran clear, and cold over stones flecked with shining grit. It was, by any honest measure, one of the most beautiful places in the country, and the men who ran the mint knew it. Their letters home spoke of the air, the views, the quiet. Their letters spoke less often of the families being marched past their windows. Here is the pattern that keeps surfacing when you read the old records side by side. A surveyor writes a report praising the gold yield of a certain creek. A few months later, a Cherokee family on that exact creek receives a notice. A few months after that, a white settler arrives holding a lottery ticket with that family's land number printed on it. The surveyor, the notice, the ticket, 3 pieces of paper, 3 different offices, 3 different men who supposedly never spoke to one another. Yet the paper trails braid together like vines on a fence post. In small towns across the Gold Belt, the same story was being told without anyone planning it. A blacksmith in one valley would mention the mint being built. A storekeeper 2 ridges over would mention the lottery. A farmer further south would mention the soldiers coming. They were all describing the same animal from different angles, the way blind men describe an elephant. None of them saw the whole shape, but the shape was there. The shape was a circle, drawn carefully and slowly around a vein of yellow metal that ran down beneath the homes of a people who had lived on that land longer than anyone could count. And at the center of the circle, the mint kept humming, day after day, turning Cherokee ground into United States coin. Picture a small wooden office in Milledgeville, Georgia, in the autumn of 1832. The walls are pine boards, plain and yellow with sap. A potbelly stove sits in the corner, ticking softly with heat. Outside, the leaves on the oak trees have turned the color of rust and old copper. Inside, a clerk sits at a long table with a wooden drum beside him. The drum is shaped like a small barrel, and it spins on a metal handle. Inside that drum are thousands of little paper tickets, each one folded tight as a moth's wing. This was the Georgia Land Lottery. And on that table, in that quiet room, the homes of the Cherokee people were being given away like raffle prizes at a county fair. Here is how it worked. The state of Georgia took all the Cherokee land within its borders and drew lines across it on a map. They cut the country up into squares. Each square was called a lot. Some lots were 160 acres of farmland and forest. Other lots, the ones in the gold country up around Dahlonega, were smaller, just 40 acres, because 40 acres of gold country was worth more than a whole valley of corn. The clerk would reach into one drum and pull out a name. Then he would reach into another drum and pull out a lot number. The name belonged to a white man somewhere in Georgia. The lot number belonged to a piece of land where a Cherokee family was already living, already sleeping, already cooking supper over a fire they had built with their own hands. Any white male citizen over the age of 18 could enter. Widows could enter. Orphans could enter. Veterans of the War of 1812 got extra draws, like bonus tickets at a church picnic. The cost to enter was small, a few cents. The reward, if your name came up, was an entire piece of someone else's world. They drew tickets for months. 85,000 lots changed hands. 85,000 pieces of Cherokee country parceled out to strangers who had never walked the land. Men in Savannah won farms they had never seen. Boys in Augusta won creek bottoms 5 days' ride away. Some winners sold their tickets right there in the street for cash to speculators who rode north with stacks of paper in their saddlebags. And here is the part that sits heavy as a stone. The Cherokee people were still living on that land. Their cabins still stood. Their orchards still bore apples. Their cattle still grazed in the long meadows. The lottery did not move them. It just gave a white man a piece of paper that said the land was his now, whenever he wanted to come and take it. So they came. They came one at a time, with wagons and rifles and deeds rolled up tight. They came to Cherokee farms and knocked on Cherokee doors and held up the paper. Some were polite about it. Some were not. A man named James Van Crawford, of mixed Cherokee blood, watched a stranger walk into his yard, point at his house, and say it belonged to him now. Crawford had no court to go to. The Georgia laws had already made sure of that. A Cherokee could not testify against a white man. A Cherokee could not own the land he was born on. The lots in the gold country went first. The clerks in Milledgeville drew those numbers with care, and the men who won them rode north fast. They came over the Blue Ridge with the cold autumn wind at their backs, and they came into valleys where the streams ran clear over yellow stones. They came to take what the maps had promised them. Some of those winners never even moved onto the land. They sold it again for more money to mining companies forming in Charleston and Philadelphia. The paper passed from hand to hand like a playing card. Each time it moved, the price went up. Each time it moved, the Cherokee family living on the actual ground became more invisible. It was the strangest kind of theft the world had ever seen. A theft done with ink and paper and a wooden drum. A theft done by clerks in clean shirts, sitting at a long table drinking coffee while they pulled out tickets. There were no masks. There were no guns in that room. Just the soft spin of the drum and the soft sound of folded paper sliding against folded paper, and the names being called out one by one into the warm yellow light of the autumn afternoon. And outside, far to the north, the people whose homes were being given away did not yet know it had happened. There is a man you need to know about now. His name was John Ross, and the thing about John Ross is that he should not have been the one to write those letters. He was only 1/8 Cherokee by blood. The rest of him was Scottish. He had blue eyes and pale skin, and he could pass for any merchant on any street in Washington City. He wore a dark wool coat and a high white collar, and he kept his hair combed back like a banker. If you saw him stepping out of a carriage on Pennsylvania Avenue, you would not have looked twice. But his heart belonged to the mountains. He had been raised among the Cherokee. He spoke their language. He prayed in their churches and traded in their stores and married into their families. And when the time came to choose a side, he chose the people who had raised him over the blood that would have let him slip away. They called him Chief John Ross. And starting in 1829, the same year that boy bent down by the creek and pulled up that yellow stone, John Ross began to write letters. He wrote to President Andrew Jackson. He wrote to the Senate. He wrote to the House of Representatives. He wrote to newspaper editors in Boston and Philadelphia and New York. He wrote to ministers and to merchants and to anyone he thought might listen. The letters were beautiful things. They were written in clean English on heavy cream paper, sealed with red wax, carried by riders across hundreds of miles of muddy roads. And here is the impossible detail. Here is the thing that should not have been possible in a country that called itself a republic of laws. Almost none of those letters were ever answered. Think about that for a moment. The elected leader of a sovereign nation, a man who had signed treaties with the United States, a man whose people had fought beside Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, wrote letter after letter to the very government that had promised to protect him. And the letters went into desks and into drawers and into the bottoms of mail sacks, and they stayed there. They were not lost. They were not stolen by bandits on the road. They arrived. They were opened. They were read. And then they were set aside. John Ross traveled to Washington himself. He took rooms at boarding houses near the Capitol. He walked up the marble steps in his polished boots, and he asked for meetings. He waited in hallways with his hat in his hand. He sent his card in on silver trays to senators who would not see him. Some days he sat in those hallways from morning until the lamps were lit, and then he walked back out into the cold and tried again the next day. He carried with him a petition. It had been signed by nearly 16,000 Cherokee. 16,000 names gathered from cabins and farms and trading posts across the Smoky Mountains. Some had signed in fine cursive. Others had pressed an inked thumb to the paper or drawn a careful X. 16,000 voices bound together in one long scroll, asking only to be left alone on the land where their grandparents were buried. The petition was delivered to Congress. It was set on a desk. It was, by all accounts, never seriously debated. Now here is what makes the silence stranger. John Ross was not some stranger to these men. He had dined with them. He had stayed in their homes. Henry Clay knew him. Daniel Webster knew him. John Quincy Adams knew him and respected him deeply. These were not men who could pretend they had never heard the name. They had shaken his hand. They had toasted his health. And still, the letters went unanswered. There is a story that one of his letters was found, years later, tucked inside an old ledger in a government office. The wax seal was still unbroken. Nobody had ever opened it. It had simply been filed away, the way you might file a bill you do not want to pay. You can sit with that for a long time and not understand it. A man writes a letter. The letter arrives. The letter is set down. And on the other end of that silence, far away in the green hills, a whole nation waits for an answer that is never coming. The gold kept coming out of the ground in Dahlonega, while those letters sat unopened. The wagons kept rolling down the muddy roads, and John Ross, with ink-stained fingers and tired blue eyes, sat down each morning and began again. Not everyone believed gold was the real reason. Not then, not now. And the people who push back have arguments worth hearing. The skeptics will tell you the story is simpler than treasure. They say the South wanted land for cotton. They say white settlers wanted farms, and the Cherokee sat on millions of acres of good soil. They say Andrew Jackson hated the tribes from his war days and never needed gold to want them gone. They say the Indian Removal Act was about empire, plain and simple. And gold is just a shiny thread we like to pull because it makes a better tale. There's truth in all of that. Cotton was king. Land hunger ran deep as the rivers. Jackson did carry old grudges from the Creek War, and he made no secret of where he stood. Removal was already on the table before the first nugget ever clinked in a tin pan. The skeptics point to the timeline. Talk of moving the tribes west goes back to Thomas Jefferson. Treaties chipping away at Cherokee land had been signed for decades. By the time the Dahlonega strike hit the papers in 1829, the gears of removal were already turning. The gold, they say, was just a bonus, a sweetener, not the cause. And they have a fair point about the numbers. Georgia made some money off that gold. Real money. But the cotton economy made more. The land itself, parceled out in that lottery, was worth far beyond what came out of the streams. If you were drawing up reasons in a ledger, soil would outweigh ore. Some historians go further. They argue that putting gold at the center of the story takes the blame off the larger system. It makes removal sound like an accident of geology. Like if the creek had run clear, the Cherokee might have kept their homes. And that, the skeptics say, lets too many people off the hook. The truth is harder. The truth is that a whole country wanted the land, gold or no gold. These are good arguments, honest ones. You can read them in serious books by serious people, and you would not be foolish to nod along. But here is where the doubters go quiet. The timing. The timing is the thing that will not sit still. The gold was found in 1828. By 1829, Georgia passed laws stripping the Cherokee of their rights inside the state. By 1830, the Indian Removal Act sailed through Congress by a thread. By 1832, the federal mint at Dahlonega was authorized, set to be built directly on top of Cherokee country. By 1838, the soldiers came. 10 years. From a yellow flake in a creek to Stockades in the pines. 10 years. And the Supreme Court of the United States looked at all of this and said no. In 1832, in a case called Worcester versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee land. The Cherokee were a sovereign nation. The state laws were void. The treaties had to stand. It was as clear a ruling as the court has ever handed down. Andrew Jackson is said to have answered with a shrug. The famous line, "Maybe real, maybe not," goes like this: "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The court said no, and nobody listened. That is the gap the skeptics cannot quite paper over. Because if removal was only about cotton and land and old grudges, why did the highest court in the land have to be ignored to make it happen? Why did the law itself have to be set aside? Something was pushing hard enough to break the machinery of the Republic. Something was worth more than the rule of law. Cotton could wait. Land could wait. Settlers had been waiting for years already. But gold in the ground, gold being pulled out by the bucket every week, gold that other men were getting rich on while you stood by. That kind of thing does not wait. That kind of thing moves governors. That kind of thing writes letters to presidents. That kind of thing builds a mint in a year. The skeptics are right that gold was not the only reason. Nothing this big ever has one reason. Removal was a wide river with many streams pouring in. Cotton was one. Old wars were one. Simple greed for soil was one. But gold was the current underneath. The fast water in the middle. The thing that turned a slow conversation into a stampede. And when the court said stop, the stampede kept running. Spring came late to the southern mountains that year. The dogwoods bloomed white along the ridges, and the redbuds threw their soft pink fire across the hollows. The streams ran fat with snowmelt, and the gold still glittered in the gravel like it always had. It was May of 1838, and the soldiers came riding up the old federal road in long blue lines. General Winfield Scott rode at the head of 7,000 men. 7,000. That number is worth holding in your mind for a moment. More soldiers than the Cherokee nation had warriors. More soldiers than most American towns had people. They came with rifles and bayonets and wagons full of rope and chain. They came to gather a whole people up like cattle and move them west. But here is the part the polished story leaves out. There were witnesses. There were always witnesses. White neighbors who had lived beside Cherokee families for 30 years. Missionaries who had baptized their children. Traders who had married into the tribes. farmers whose fields touched Cherokee fields along the same crooked fence lines. These people saw what happened, and some of them spoke up, and some of them never stopped speaking up until the day they died. One of them was a young soldier named John Burnett. He was a private from Tennessee. He spoke the Cherokee language because he had grown up hunting these mountains with Cherokee boys. The army made him a translator. They put him at the front of the columns because he could tell the people what was coming, and what he saw in those spring weeks broke something inside him that never healed. Burnett wrote it all down. He wrote it as an old man decades later, on his 80th birthday. He gave the story to his grandchildren as a gift. He told them about families pulled from supper tables with the food still warm on the plates. He told them about a mother who watched her dying baby taken from her arms. He told them about old men too sick to walk being dragged across their own thresholds. And he told them in plain words why it all happened. He said the gold in the hills was the reason. He said the lust for that yellow metal had driven the whole bitter business. He named it. He did not hide behind softer words. He was not the only one. A missionary named Evan Jones walked the trail beside the people he had served for 20 years. He wrote letters. He sent them north. He named names and listed dates and described the wagons and the weather and the dead. Daniel Butrick, another missionary, kept a journal in tight black ink through every cold mile. He wrote of children dying in his arms. He wrote of fevers. He wrote of soldiers who showed kindness and soldiers who did not. These men paid a price for what they said. They were called troublemakers. They were called Indian lovers. They lost friends. They lost livings. Some of them lost their churches, but they kept the records. They kept the names. They kept the truth the way a man keeps a coin in his pocket, turning it over and over until the edges go smooth. The soldiers themselves were not all stone. Many were boys from Georgia and Tennessee farms. Many had never been more than 50 miles from home. They watched their officers point at houses and say, "Take them." And the boys went and took them. But some of those boys carried the memory like a stone in the chest for the rest of their lives. Years later, on porches in Alabama and Kentucky and Missouri, old men would tell their grandchildren the same kinds of stories Burnett told. The crying, the cold suppers, the look on the faces of mothers. You can still find these accounts if you know where to look. They sit in dusty archives in small Georgia libraries. They sit in Baptist Mission records up in New England. They sit in old family Bibles where someone long ago wrote a few sentences on the back page about what their great-grandfather had seen. The official story stayed polished, but the witness stories never went away. They just got quieter. The wagons rolled. The stockades filled. The dogwoods kept blooming, white and innocent above it all. And down in the creek beds, untouched by any of it, the gold kept catching the sun. Small, bright flakes in the cold spring water. Tiny pieces of the reason. Sitting there, patient as ever, while the people who had known about them for 1,000 years were marched away under guard. The land in North Georgia keeps a long memory. Walk into the pine woods around Cleveland or New Echota or Fort Buffington on a soft afternoon, and you can feel it. The light comes down through the tall trunks in pale yellow bars. The needles cover the ground like a thick brown blanket, soft under your boots. The air smells of resin and old rain. And here and there, in places the old maps still mark, the ground does strange things. There are clearings in those woods where the grass grows in odd patterns. A long rectangle of low green, hemmed in by taller weeds. If you stand at the edge and look down, you can see the shape of something that used to be there. A wall, maybe. A fence line. A floor of packed dirt that never fully let the forest back in. The locals call these the old stockade grounds. The federal soldiers built rough wooden pens in the spring of 1838 to hold the Cherokee before the long walk west. Most of those pens were torn down or rotted away within a generation, but the earth underneath them remembers. Farmers in those parts will tell you stories. A man tries to put up a barn on one of those flat spots, and the corners keep sinking. He pours a new foundation, and it cracks before the first winter ends. He gives up and moves the barn 40 feet to the south, and that one stands for 90 years. There is a place near Spring Place where a family tried 3 times to dig a well. Each time the water came up cloudy and tasted of iron. finally gave up and hauled water from the creek instead. The trees grow differently on the old stockade ground. Foresters who have walked these hills their whole lives know the look. The pines come up thin and twisted, like they cannot quite settle their roots. The hardwoods stay short. In one meadow near Fort Hetzel, a stand of dogwoods blooms every spring in a perfect ring, white as bone, with empty ground inside the ring where nothing takes hold. People have planted things there: tomatoes, beans, even just a patch of clover. Nothing grows in that ring. The dirt is the same as the dirt 10 feet away. The sun falls the same, but the ring stays empty. The rivers tell their own stories too. The Chattahoochee, the Etowah, the Hiwassee, the Coosa, they all run through this country, and they have all changed course a dozen times since the soldiers came. A creek that used to pass right by an old gathering ground will swing wide around it now, like the water itself has chosen another way. Old fishermen will point to a dry gravel bed and say, "That used to be the channel." Then they point to the new channel 50 yards over and shake their heads. The river moved sometime in the 1850s, they say. Nobody knows why. Animals know the meadows too. There is a clearing somewhere off the old federal road, deep in Lumpkin County, where deer will not bed down. Hunters have sat in stands at the edge of that meadow for whole seasons and seen nothing cross it. The deer go around. The turkeys go around. Even the coyotes that drift through every other holler at dusk seem to keep their distance. The grass there grows tall and pale and bends in the wind like wheat that never gets cut. If you stand in the middle of it at the right hour, you can hear the wind moving through the pines on every side, but the air inside the clearing stays still. The mountains themselves seem to lean in over these places. The ridges around Dahlonega and Ellijay and Murphy have a way of holding the fog low in the morning. The mist settles into the hollows and sits there until midday, soft and white, like the land is breathing slowly. Old folks say the fog is thickest over the spots where the people were held. They say it on porches and in feed stores and at small country churches, the way you pass down something that nobody can quite prove. Maybe it is only the shape of the ground. Maybe the hollows hold the cool air longer. Maybe the trees grow strange because the soil was packed hard by hundreds of feet for weeks on end. Maybe the rivers moved because rivers always move, but the people who live there know what they know. The land does not lie. The land does not forget. And under the soft pines, the rectangles of low grass still mark the places where the gates once stood. The walk west did not begin all at once. It started in pieces, in groups, in long, slow lines of people leaving their homes with whatever they could carry on their backs. Some left in summer when the air was still warm. Some left in fall when the leaves were just beginning to turn red and gold along the ridges. And some, the ones who would suffer most, left in the deep cold of winter, when the rivers ran with ice and the wind cut straight through cloth. The route ran west and north, then west again, across rivers and mountains, through Tennessee and Kentucky, into the flat, dark country of southern Illinois, then down through Missouri, and into the new land that white men called Indian Territory. It was over 1,000 miles. Some walked the whole way. Others rode in wagons when they could. Many traveled by boat down the Tennessee River, then the Ohio, then the Mississippi, on flatboats that smelled of pine tar and wet rope. The sky above them changed as they walked. The thick green canopy of the southern mountains gave way to open hardwood forests. The hardwoods gave way to prairie. The red clay turned to black soil, then to pale dust. Every step took them further from the place where the gold had been pulled out of the ground. Every step took them further from the creeks they knew by name. And here is where the story stops being just one story. Because what happened to the Cherokee happened to other peoples too, in other places, in other years. The pattern repeats across the map of America like a song played in different keys. In the 1860s, men found gold in the Black Hills of Dakota. The Black Hills belonged to the Lakota by treaty. The treaty was clear. The treaty had been signed in good faith. But once the gold was confirmed, the treaty became inconvenient. Soldiers came. Miners flooded in. The Lakota were told the land was no longer theirs. The same shape, the same outline, different mountains, different people, same yellow metal underneath. In the 1850s, the Modoc people of Northern California watched white settlers pour into their valleys. The land was good. The streams were full. There were rumors, always rumors, of gold in the high country. The Modoc were pushed onto a reservation. When they tried to come home, they were hunted through lava beds for months. The pattern again, just wearing different clothes. In Oklahoma in 1889, the government threw open lands that had been promised to displaced tribes forever. They called it a land run. Men lined up at the border on horseback and waited for a gun to fire. When the gun fired, they raced into the territory to claim plots that had belonged, on paper, to people who had already been moved once. Some of those people were Cherokee, the same Cherokee who had walked the long road from Georgia. They had been told the new land was theirs as long as the grass grew and the water ran. The grass kept growing. The water kept running. The promise did not. Even further back, in the 1700s, the Spanish in the Southwest had done the same kind of arithmetic with Pueblo land along the Rio Grande. Even further west, in the late 1800s, the Nez Perce were chased across more than 1,000 miles of mountain country after gold was found near their valleys in Idaho. Their leader, Chief Joseph, gave a speech at the end of that long walk that people still read today. He said he would fight no more forever. The pines where he spoke those words still stand. The bones of his people are still buried under them. The shape is always the same. Something valuable is found. The people who lived there first are suddenly in the way. Laws are written. Treaties are bent. Soldiers arrive. A long walk begins. And years later, the story gets polished into something simpler. Something that does not mention the metal in the ground or the men who got rich from it. The Cherokee walking west in the winter of 1838 did not know they were part of a pattern. They only knew their feet hurt and their children were cold. And the sky above the Mississippi River was the gray of old iron. They only knew that the smoke of their old cabins was still rising somewhere behind them, and that the gold their grandfathers had walked past for 1,000 years had finally cost them everything. The road kept going. The wind kept blowing. And the country they were walking into was still strange to them, still flat, still waiting to be learned. The winter of 1838 came down hard on the trail. Snow fell in Kentucky. Snow fell in Illinois. Snow fell across the wide Missouri and out into the bare hills beyond. And under that snow, things were left behind. Small things, quiet things, the kind of things that don't make it into a history book, but do make it into a glass case at a small museum somewhere in Oklahoma or Tennessee. You can still see some of them today. There is a wooden spoon, no bigger than a child's hand, carved smooth from years of use. It was found near a creek bed in southern Illinois, miles from any town. A woman picking blackberries saw the handle sticking out of the mud. The wood was dark as old coffee. The bowl of the spoon was worn thin on one side, the way a spoon wears when the same hand uses it over and over for years. There is a brass thimble, green with time, picked up by a farmer plowing a field outside a place called Hopkinsville. There is a child's shoe, the leather curled and stiff, with the stitching still holding after almost 200 years. There are buttons, lots of buttons, bone buttons, pewter buttons, buttons stamped with little stars that came off coats somewhere along the way and pressed down into the cold ground and waited. Each of these things tells you something the polished story does not. A spoon means a family ate. A thimble means a woman sewed. A button means a coat was worn thin and finally let go. These were not soldiers' things. These were home things. The kind of things people pack when they think they are going to set up a kitchen again on the other side. There are letters, too. Not many, but enough. A young Army officer named John Burnett wrote one to his children many years later on his 80th birthday. He told them what he had seen as a private soldier in the removal. He wrote about the cold. He wrote about an old chief named Junaluska weeping by the side of the road. He wrote about a woman who died in a wagon with her baby still wrapped against her chest. The letter sat in a family drawer for decades. When somebody finally read it out loud, the room went quiet as a chapel. There are journals kept by missionaries who walked alongside. Daniel Butrick filled page after page with small daily notes. The wind today, the number of graves dug, the name of a man who carved a flute and played it by the fire at night. His handwriting is small and careful, like he knew somebody would need to read it one day and understand. There are sketches drawn quickly on the backs of letters of wagons strung out along a frozen river. There is a map, folded so many times the creases turned to soft cloth, that shows the campsites marked with little X's. The X's stop and start where the rivers froze and the ice would not break. And then there are the photographs, taken much later, when old men and old women who had been children on the trail finally sat down in front of a camera. Their faces are still. Their eyes look straight at you. In one picture, an old woman holds a small leather pouch in her lap. The pouch holds, the family says, a single grain of corn from the last harvest in Georgia. She carried it her whole life. She passed it to her daughter. The daughter passed it on. In the background of another photograph, taken at a Cherokee home in Indian Territory around 1890, there sits a stone on a wooden shelf. Just a plain river stone, smooth and dark. The story in that family is that the stone came from the creek near Dahlonega, the creek where the gold was first found. Somebody picked it up on the morning they left and carried it 1,000 miles. The stone outlived every person who ever touched it. It is still sitting on a shelf somewhere, in a quieter house now, doing the same work. These are the artifacts, spoons and buttons and stones and letters. None of them prove a conspiracy. None of them tell you who took the gold or who knew what when. But you can hold them. You can feel the weight of the brass thimble between your fingers. You can run your thumb along the worn bowl of the spoon. And when you do, the polished story gets a little harder to swallow, because somebody used these things. Somebody loved them enough to pack them. And then the snow came down and covered everything and waited for a long, long time. Some stories live in books. Others live in kitchens. The Trail of Tears lives in both places, but the kitchen version is the one that holds the small details. The names that never made it onto the federal rolls. The grandmothers who hid in the laurel thickets while soldiers searched the cabins below. The babies born under wagon canvas who got no birth certificate and no record at all. These stories pass from one set of hands to the next at Thanksgiving tables and Christmas suppers, told over coffee while the dishes soak in the sink. A woman in eastern Oklahoma might tell you her great-great-grandmother was 7 years old in the spring of 1838. The little girl hid inside a hollow chestnut tree, while her mother led the soldiers down a different path. The mother never came back. The girl walked out 3 days later and joined a wagon train of strangers. She remembered the smell of that chestnut wood for the rest of her life. She named her first daughter Chestnut, and that name passed down through 5 generations. A man in North Georgia might pull out a small leather pouch his grandfather gave him. Inside the pouch sit 3 river-worn pebbles and a single gold flake the size of a fingernail. The story goes that his great-great-grandfather buried a coffee can of gold dust under a particular oak tree before the soldiers came. The family planned to come back for it. They never did. The oak still stands on land that belongs to somebody else now, and the coffee may still be there and may not. The flake in the pouch is what's left of the proof. These stories twist and bend with each telling. Some details get polished smooth like creek stones. The soldier becomes crueler. The grandmother becomes braver. The hiding place becomes more clever. Some details quietly drop away. A cousin who didn't survive the walk gets mentioned once and then forgotten. A brother who turned informer never gets named at all. The shame of certain truths makes the storyteller skip a line. And after 2 generations, that line is simply gone. But the core stays steady. The core is always the same. Gold was in the ground. White men wanted it. The Cherokee were told to leave. The leaving killed thousands. And somebody in the family remembers. In Cherokee, North Carolina, where the Eastern Band still lives on the land, their ancestors refused to leave. Families tell a different version. Their great-great-grandparents hid in the high coves of the Smokies. They lived on chestnuts and trout, and whatever the steep slopes would grow. They watched the wagons roll west from a distance and held their breath until the soldiers were gone. Some of them came down only at night for years. Some of them never came down at all and died in the mountains they had hidden in. The names of those mountain hiders rarely appear in any government paper. They were not counted because they were not supposed to exist. The census takers wrote down the people who took the walk and the people who took the deal. The ones who slipped into the rhododendron and disappeared simply vanished from the record. Their descendants know who they are. The paper does not. In Oklahoma, the descendants of those who walked carry a different weight. They tell of grandmothers who would not speak of Georgia, grandfathers who flinched at the word gold, old women who kept a single dogwood twig pressed in a Bible because dogwood bloomed along the trail and was the last thing they saw of home. One family in the Cookson Hills tells of a great-grandmother who would walk outside every spring when the redbuds came in and stand alone in the yard and cry for an hour. Nobody asked her why. They all knew why. The stories travel through marriage. A Cherokee woman marries into a Choctaw family, and her stories blend with theirs. A descendant moves to California, and the stories go west again. A boy goes to college in Boston and tells his roommate about the chestnut tree, and the roommate writes it down in a journal that ends up in a library 100 years later. The story keeps moving, the way water keeps moving, finding new channels when the old ones dry up. And the gold always comes back into the telling somewhere. A pebble in a pouch, a buried can under an oak, a flake on a string around a child's neck, small bright pieces of a country that the family no longer owned, kept close because the keeping was the only justice anyone ever got. While the Cherokee walked west through frozen mud, the hills they left behind kept giving up their secret. The gold did not stop. It never stopped. That is the quiet truth at the center of this whole story, the part that gets passed over in the school books. Year after year, men in flannel shirts waded into the creeks around Dahlonega and pulled yellow flakes from the gravel. They worked the same bends in the same streams the Cherokee had worked for centuries. The water still ran cold and clear over the white quartz stones. The same blue mist still rose off the ridges at dawn. The only thing that changed was who got to keep what the mountain offered. By the early 1840s, the easy gold near the surface was thinning out. But the men who stayed behind learned to dig. They followed the veins down into the red clay. They built timber frames and rocker boxes and long wooden sluices that snaked across the hillsides like wet ribs. They blasted into the rock with black powder. Smoke drifted up from 100 small shafts, and the smell of cut pine and gunpowder hung over the hollows. Whole towns grew up around the dig sites. Auraria, Knucklesville, Cane Creek. Little clusters of clapboard cabins with tin roofs that pinged in the rain. General stores that smelled of coffee beans and saddle leather. Boarding houses where miners slept 4 to a room, their boots caked in red mud at the door. Blacksmith shops where the hammers rang out before sunrise. The mountain fed all of it, and the gold kept coming. It came in dust, in flakes, in nuggets the size of corn kernels. It came in long ropes of quartz threaded with yellow that men cracked open like loaves of bread. They took it to the Federal Mint in Dahlonega, that handsome brick building with its tall white columns, and they walked out with coins stamped with a tiny D under the eagle. Those coins traveled everywhere. They paid for sugar in New Orleans and saddles in St. Louis. They bought passage on steamboats and crossed oceans in the pockets of travelers who never thought once about where the metal had come from. The men who pulled this gold from the ground were not all rich. Most were not. They were tenant miners and hired hands, paid pennies on the dollar for back-breaking work. They got the lung sickness from breathing rock dust. They got crushed by falling timbers. They drowned in the spring floods when the sluices broke. But they stayed because the mountain kept whispering that the next strike was just one more shovelful away. A community grew up around that whisper. Children were born in Dahlonega who knew the smell of crushed ore before they knew the smell of the sea. Old men sat on porch rails and pointed to ridges where their fathers had worked. Women kept gardens behind the cabins and traded eggs for thread at the company store. Churches went up on the hilltops, white-painted boxes with little steeples that caught the morning sun. Graveyards filled with stones carved by miners who had a little extra time on Sundays. This place mattered to the people who lived there. It still does. You can drive through those Georgia hills today and find families who can name their great-great-grandfathers and tell you which creek they panned. The gold made them. It also made the silence around what came before them. Because here is the part that sits heavy. Every wagon load of ore that rolled into the Dahlonega mint was rolling across ground that had belonged to someone else only a few years before. Every cabin sat on a square of land, won in a lottery drum. Every garden grew over the footprint of an older garden whose tender was walking toward Oklahoma. The community was real. The work was real. The love those families had for their hollows and ridges was real. None of that is in question. What gets buried, like the gold itself, is the cost. The two truths sit on top of each other like layers of stone. A place can be home and a wound at the same time. A history can be proud and stained at the same time. The mountain does not sort it out for you. It just keeps doing what mountains do. It holds the bones of the old chestnut forests. It holds the foundations of the stockades, half sunk now into moss. It holds the gold that is still down there, in veins nobody has touched, waiting in the dark for whatever comes next. And the creeks keep running, cold and bright, carrying their little yellow secrets toward the sea. Stand with me for a moment in Dahlonega at night. The year is 1861, and the Federal Mint has closed its doors for the last time. The lamps inside have gone dark. The big iron presses sit cold and still, like sleeping animals that have eaten their fill and finally laid down. The building is brick and tall and plain, with white columns out front that catch the moonlight like bones. Wide steps lead up to a heavy door. Above the door, a single window stares out at the square. Inside, the floors are scuffed from 25 years of boots, tracking gold dust across the planks. The walls still smell faintly of coal smoke and hot metal. You stand on the dirt road in front of it. The air is cool against your face. Somewhere down the street, a horse shifts in a stable. A dog barks once and then forgets why. The shutters on the houses are closed for the night, and thin lines of orange firelight slip out from under a few of the doors. Most of the windows are dark. Above you, the sky has opened up the way mountain skies do. Thousands of stars hang in the black, and between them runs the pale wash of the Milky Way, like spilled cream on slate. The moon is half full and tilted, leaning back as if it had grown tired of watching. The light it throws is soft and silver and cold. The hills rise around the town in every direction. You cannot see them clearly in the dark, but you can feel them. They lean in close, dark on dark, their ridges traced faintly against the stars. Pine trees cover them like a thick blanket of fur. The wind moves through those trees with a long, slow sound, like a held breath finally let go. Down below, somewhere past the houses, the Cherokee River runs in the dark. You can hear it if you listen. It is a quiet sound, a steady murmur over stones, the same sound it made when the first Cherokee child set bare feet on its bank 1,000 years ago. The same sound it made the day the boy bent down and picked up the yellow rock. The river does not care who owns it. The river just runs. The gold is still down there, in the gravel of the creeks, in the quartz veins under the hills, in the dark roots of the mountains where no man has ever set a pick. The mint has closed, but the gold has not gone anywhere. It rests where it has always rested, glinting in the dark, patient as a stone. You take a step. The dirt is soft under your boot. A small breath of wind brushes your cheek and carries the smell of wood smoke and damp pine and something older, something like cold rock and wet leaves. The mountains in autumn always smell that way. It is a smell that does not change with centuries. An owl calls from the woods at the edge of town. One long note, then silence. Somewhere far off, a second owl answers. The two of them speak across the hills, and then the quiet folds back in. Look at the mint again. In the dim light, the building looks smaller than it did by day. Just a brick box, just a place where men weighed and stamped and counted. The gold that passed through those doors built fortunes 1,000 miles away. It paid for houses and ships and white marble columns in cities the Cherokee never saw. And then, when the war came and the South pulled away from the North, the doors closed and the work moved on, and the town began to grow quiet again. The Boomtown is fading. The crowds have thinned. The miners are drifting toward other rivers, other rumors. The square that once roared with auctions and arguments has settled into a country hush. The hills are taking the town back slowly, the way they take everything back. You tilt your head up. The stars are so thick they feel close enough to touch. You feel small under them, the kind of small that is not lonely, but peaceful, the way a stone feels small at the bottom of a deep river. The same stars looked down on the Cherokee mothers walking west. The same stars looked down on the boy with the yellow rock. The same stars are looking down on you now. A long, low wind moves through the pines on the ridge. The mint stands silent. The river runs on, and the hills, dark and ancient and full of buried light, breathe in and out around you like a sleeping giant who remembers everything and tells nothing. When the Cherokee walked west, they carried more than blankets and tools. They carried stories. Stories travel light. They fit inside a person, tucked behind the ribs, and they cannot be taken at the door of a stockade or dropped in the snow. The old people understood this. They taught the children the songs along the road in low voices, the way you teach a fire to keep burning through a long night. Some of those stories were about the gold itself. The Cherokee had known about the yellow metal in the creeks long before the white prospectors came clawing at the hills. They had a name for it, and they had a feeling about it. Gold was beautiful, yes, but it was also a thing that made men forget themselves. The elders told it like a warning. Touch it lightly. Wear it if you must, but do not let it climb inside your chest and live there, because once it does, it eats everything else. That story traveled west with them. It settled into the new land in Indian territory, into the red clay and the rolling grass, and it kept being told around the cook fires of Tahlequah and the cabins of the Going Snake District. Grandmothers told it to grandchildren who had never seen the blue mountains of home. The mountains stayed alive in the telling. The creeks stayed alive. The trees with their soft green light stayed alive in words, even when the feet that had walked beneath them were gone to dust. Back in Georgia, the place itself kept its own kind of memory. Dahlonega grew into a town of brick storefronts and white church steeples, of dogwood blossoms in April and red leaves in October. The old Mint building still stands on a hill, its stone walls thick and pale, its windows watching the square the way. An old man watches a room full of strangers. Every fall, the town holds a festival called Gold rush days. Children pan for flakes in wooden troughs. Fiddlers play on the courthouse lawn. There is funnel cake and lemonade, and a parade with antique cars rolling slow down the main street. The festival is happy. It is meant to be, but anyone who knows the deeper story feels a strange double layer to the celebration. The way a song can be sweet on top and sorrowful underneath if you listen close. The gold that built the town is the same gold that emptied the hills of the people who had named them. Both things are true at once. The town has learned to hold both, even if it does not always say so out loud. Up in the Smoky Mountains, in a town called Cherokee, North Carolina, a smaller band of the people still lives on the old ground. They are the descendants of those who hid in the high coves when the soldiers came, who slipped through the laurel thickets and waited out the roundup in caves and on ridgelines. Their children kept the language alive. Their grandchildren learned the dances. Today, you can walk into the museum there and see baskets woven so tight they hold water, and pottery stamped with patterns older than any treaty. In the summer, an outdoor play runs in a hillside theater under the stars. It tells the story of the removal. Real Cherokee actors walk the stage. The mountains stand behind them in the dark. When the soldiers come on, the audience grows quiet, even the children. When the people walk west, a low drum carries the footsteps. By the end, half the audience is crying, and the actors take their bows, and the crickets in the trees sing on like nothing has changed. The way of looking at the world that came out of all this is hard to put into plain words. It is a way of holding two things in one hand. The land is beautiful and the land is grieving. The gold is precious and the gold is poison. The story is finished and the story is still going on. People raised in these hills, both Cherokee and not, learn this double sight early. They learn that a creek can be a creek and also a memory, that a town can be cheerful and also haunted, that a song can be sung at a festival and also whispered on a long road in winter. The old stories the Cherokee carried west were not just about loss. They were about how to keep being a people when the ground itself has been taken away. They were about how to plant something new in new dirt and still remember the taste of the old water. They were about gold, always about gold, and the strange power it has to make a country forget what it has done. There is a road in Georgia that most people drive over without knowing it. It runs under newer highways now, paved and repaved, widened for trucks and gas stations and fast food signs. But underneath all that asphalt lies the old federal road, the one the soldiers used, the one the Cherokee walked when they were forced from their homes in the autumn of 1838. A woman named Rebecca Carter drove that road in the summer of 1972. She was 63 years old. She lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a small white house with a porch swing and a garden full of tomatoes. Her great-grandmother had walked the Trail of Tears as a girl of 9. The story had been handed down in her family like a piece of china wrapped in cloth, taken out only on special evenings. Rebecca had never seen Georgia. She had heard about it her whole life. Her great-grandmother spoke of mountains so blue they looked painted, of creeks running clear over white stones, of dogwood trees blooming like clouds caught in the branches. She spoke of the gold, too. Always the gold. How it shined in the streams like fish scales. How the white men came hunting it the way wolves hunt deer. So Rebecca packed a small suitcase and drove east in her green Ford. She crossed Arkansas and Tennessee and finally came down into the North Georgia hills. The mountains rose up exactly as her great-grandmother had described them. Soft and blue and folded against each other like sleeping animals. The air smelled of pine sap and red clay. She stopped in Dahlonega first. The town had a square with a brick courthouse in the middle. Old men sat on benches and watched her with mild curiosity. She walked into a cafe and ordered coffee and asked the waitress if anyone still talked about the Cherokee. The waitress shrugged. She said her grandfather used to find arrowheads in his cornfield. That was all she knew. Rebecca drove south on the old federal road that afternoon. The road wound through pine forest and past kudzu-covered barns. The light came down in long golden bars between the trees. She rolled the window down and let the warm wind move through the car. She stopped at a place called New Echota. It had been the Cherokee capital once. A whole town with a council house and a newspaper and printed laws. Now it was just a quiet field with a few reconstructed buildings standing in the grass. The grass was tall and brown. Cicadas screamed in the trees. Rebecca walked the empty paths alone. She said later that she felt something there. Not a fear, not a haunting in the way movies tell it, just a presence, a weight, like the land itself remembered who used to walk it. The wind moved through the dry corn at the edge of the field and made a sound like whispered voices in a language she didn't speak. She drove back to Tulsa with a small jar of red Georgia clay in her glove compartment. She kept it on her windowsill for the rest of her life. When her grandchildren came to visit, she would point at the jar and tell them the story about the boy who found gold in the creek, about the lottery where strangers won her family's farm, about the long walk west in the snow. Her grandchildren grew up and moved to Chicago and California and Denver. They carried the story with them the way she had. The story changed a little in each telling. Some details fell away. New details crept in, but the heart of it stayed the same. There was gold in the mountains. The gold was the reason. Nobody in the school books would say so, but the family knew. This is how legends survive. Not in archives, not in museums. They survive in kitchens and on porches and in the cabs of pickup trucks at dusk. They survive in the way a grandmother folds a story into a granddaughter's memory, along with the smell of cornbread and the sound of a screen door slapping shut. Rebecca Carter died in 1989. Her ashes were scattered in the Arkansas River, halfway between Tulsa and the mountains she only saw once. Her jar of red Georgia clay sits on a shelf in her granddaughter's kitchen in Albuquerque. The clay has dried and cracked over the years. It looks like a tiny piece of broken pottery now, the color of rust and old blood. The federal road is still there too, patched over with new pavement, traveled by people who don't know what they're driving on. But the road remembers. The hills remember. And somewhere in Oklahoma and somewhere in Albuquerque, a family still tells the story exactly as it was given to them. There is a strange thing about old records. They tell you what someone wanted you to know. rarely tell you what someone wanted you to forget. If you sit in the archives in Atlanta, or in Washington, or down in the old courthouse at Dahlonega, you can read the official story of those years. You can find the land lottery rolls. You can find the names of the men who drew lucky numbers and rode up into the hills to claim their 40 acres of someone else's home. You can find the receipts for the gold that came out of the mint, stamped and weighed and signed for in tidy ink. What you cannot find in any of those papers is a single sentence that says the gold was the reason. The letters between the governors and the generals talk about civilization. They talk about progress. They talk about the need to move the Cherokee for their own good. They use soft words, polished words, the kind of words that slip past a reader like smooth stones in a stream bed. The word gold appears here and there, but never in the same sentence as the word removal, never linked, never blamed. The two facts sit on opposite sides of the page, and the white space between them is wide as a river. That white space is the mystery. Because the gold was there, everyone knew the gold was there. The miners knew. The governor knew. The president knew. The Cherokee knew most of all, because they had walked over it for 1,000 years and given it a name in their own tongue. And yet, when the time came to write down why a whole people had to leave their mountains, the gold became invisible. It vanished from the paperwork like mist burning off a meadow at sunrise. You can read every law passed in Georgia in those years and find no mention of treasure. You can read Andrew Jackson's speeches and find only talk of Indian welfare and national destiny. You can read the Treaty of New Echota and find clauses about cattle and corn and wagons, but nothing about the quartz veins running under the Cherokee fields like buried lightning. It is as if the gold did the work and then quietly left the room before anyone could write its name down. And so the question stays open, like a door that no one ever quite closed. Was it greed, dressed up in the language of progress? Was it politics, with the gold as the silent partner in the back of every meeting? Was it something even older, the old hunger that has driven men across oceans and over mountains since the first shining thing was pulled from the first dark place in the earth? The records will not tell you. The records were written by by the winners, and the winners had every reason to keep the gold out of the story. But the land remembers. The creeks still carry yellow flakes after a hard rain. The old shafts still tunnel into the hillsides above Dahlonega, their wooden braces softened by 100 years of moss. The Mint building still stands, repurposed now, a quiet brick shape on a college campus where students walk past without knowing what was weighed inside those walls. And out in Oklahoma, in homes that smell of cedar and wood smoke, families still tell their children the old names of the mountains they have never seen. Two stories running side by side, never quite touching in the official record. The story of the gold, the story of the walk. One celebrated, one mourned, both pretending the other was not in the room. Maybe that is why people keep coming back to this. Not to solve it, because it cannot be solved now. The men who could have answered the question are long in their graves, and they took their reasons with them. The papers they left behind were careful papers, the kind written by men who knew that someday someone would read them. What keeps people coming back is the shape of the silence, the way the gold and the grief line up so perfectly when you hold them up to the light. And yet the documents insist they have nothing to do with each other. The way the dates match, the way the maps match, the way the timing is too clean to be an accident and too quiet to be a confession. Somewhere between those two stories is the truth, and the truth has never been written down. It lives in the white space. It lives in the place where the records forgot to mention what every miner, every soldier, every Cherokee child already knew. And that is where we will leave it tonight, sitting in the white space, listening for what the paper would not say. So here we are, back at the end of the long road. The fire has burned down to a soft orange bed. The wood pops once, then settles. Somewhere out past the trees, an owl calls, and the night holds its breath to listen. Think of the mountain for a moment. The one in North Georgia, where this all began. Dahlonega still sits at its feet, quiet now, with a small square and a courthouse and a brick chimney where the old Mint once stood. The gilded dome of the courthouse shines on bright days like a tiny piece of the original story, lifted up where everyone can see it. Children walk past it on their way to school. Tourists take pictures and move on. The creeks still run cold there, the way they always have. The water slides over smooth stones, dark as tea where it pools, bright as glass where it tumbles. If you knelt by one of those creeks today and ran your fingers through the gravel, you might still find a fleck of gold caught in the lines of your palm. People do, every year. The mountain has not stopped giving up what it carries. The pines lean over the old federal road, taller now than they were in 1838. The ruts where the wagons rolled have softened into shallow grooves in the moss. Wild blackberry climbs through the underbrush. Deer cross the trail at dusk and pay no mind to what was once carried along it. Out west, in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation kept going. They built schools. They printed newspapers in their own letters, the ones Sequoia gave them. Those graceful curls and crosses that look like nothing else on earth. They held onto songs that were old when the boats first touched these shores. They held onto names. They held onto each other, and the question still sits there, patient as a stone in a stream bed. Did the gold pull the trigger on all of it? Was it the yellow flecks in the water that made men in distant rooms sign the papers that emptied a homeland? The official histories shrug. The treaties speak of other things, but the timing of it all hums like a tuning fork. The discovery, the lottery, the mint, the soldiers, the road, the mountain remembers. That is what the old people say. Not in words, not in books, in the way the mist sits in the hollows on cold mornings, in the way certain meadows feel hushed even at noon, in the way a single crow will land on a fence post and watch you for a long time before it lifts away. Stories are how we keep the memory honest, not the polished kind in the school books with their tidy maps and their clean dates. The other kind, the kind told by a low fire where the speaker pauses to let a thought settle